Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's JFK Jr. Forum at the IOP. Today, in celebration of Women's History Month, we bring together two wildly impressive women to talk about the incredible stories of women's courage, leadership, and resilience in the face of adversity. My name is Izzy Ernst. I'm a master's student at the Kennedy School and co-chair of W3D, Women in Defense, Diplomacy and Development, one of the co-sponsors of today's event. W3D was founded on the idea that gender equality and international peace go hand in hand, and that women have to support each other to excel and be better allies in foreign policy. Shedding the spotlight on the contribution of women in conflict zones is close to my heart. During the European refugee crisis in 2015, I had the enormous privilege to work for the German government on their efforts to accommodate and integrate hundreds of thousands of people fleeing from war. In my work with refugees, it was always the women who deeply impressed me and touched my soul. Their quiet strength, their capacity to love and to hope, and their gratitude for the little things despite the unfathomable challenges they had faced. Women's History Month is a time to remember and highlight the many stories of heroism that were left untold because the protagonists were never given the recognition they deserved. Without the amazing women before and around us, we wouldn't be here today. So there's no better way for us to use this platform than to elevate the stories of women that deserve to be told.
Hello, everyone. My name is Hannah Botterell. I'm a first year at Harvard College, planning to study either government or history and literature, and I'm originally from Missouri, but currently living on campus in Grays Hall. Growing up in an immigrant family has certainly shaped my political passions, and I'm particularly interested in immigrant and refugee rights, foreign policy, and gender parity in American politics. That said, I'm so thrilled to introduce Gail Lemon and Juliette Kayyem, two women who are at the forefront of these important conversations regarding security, women's rights, and international relations. Here at the JFK Jr. Forum at the Institute of Politics, we feel strongly about sharing unique stories and diverse perspectives to educate, inform, and inspire future leaders. The celebration of Women's History Month reminds us of the importance of continuing to fill in the pages of our history that have often remained absent. And I'm so honored to bring together two incredible women to share their stories with our community today. It's my great pleasure to first introduce Gail Lemon, author of 3 New York Times bestsellers focused on courageous women in dangerous places. Her most recent book, The Daughters of Kobani, shares the story of what ISIS has left in its wake. It's the most far-reaching experiment in women's equality in the least likely place in the world, brought to you by women who have been battling ISIS town by town, street by street, since 2013. Lemmon, who serves as an adjunct senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, along with private sector leadership roles in emerging technology and national security firms, began writing about entrepreneurship in conflict and post-conflict zones while studying for her MBA at Harvard, following a decade covering politics at the ABC News political unit. This conversation will be moderated by Professor Juliette Kayyem. Juliette has spent over 20 years managing complex policy initiatives and organizing government responses to major crises in both state and federal government. A national leader in homeland security, resiliency, and safety, she is currently the Senior Belfer Lecturer in International Security at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, where she is faculty chair of the Homeland Security and Global Health projects. Next week, we hope you will join us on Wednesday, March 24th at 6 p.m. as we host Delaware Senator Chris Coons on national service and the Biden agenda, with IOP Director Mark Guerin moderating. Senator Coons is a lead Senate sponsor of major national service legislation and co-chair of the National Service Caucus. Thank you so much to all who are joining us for today's conversation, and of course, a special thanks to Juliette and Gail for what I'm sure will be an exceptionally interesting and timely conversation. I'll pass it over to you, Juliette.
Thank you all. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Izzy. I know Yvonne is hiding in the background there, and Nanda and Kathy and Morgan and the whole group that brought this together rather quickly. And we are thrilled to have Gail here for this event during this this month, and in light of the success and importance of her book. I have it here, The Daughters of Kobani. I have an early version, and she has a poster behind her. Now, because I have done this before. I am warning everyone, I've got like multimedia going on here. I'm not distracted. I'm getting text about the questions that you all have, and I have my notes here. So I am fully engaged, but we wanted to make sure that students and others can chime in. So I will be monitoring your questions, and we'll bring you in about half an hour. But I am absolutely thrilled to have Gail here. We have been trying to get her here physically for some time, and just thrilled that she has joined us for this discussion. What Gail has done in the Daughters of Kobani is told a story about young female fighters who were instrumental in defending their homeland against ISIS. This was not window dressing. This was not, oh, they just stood behind the men. This was actually as organizers, as fighters, as leaders, how they essentially beat back ISIS in the last couple of years. So that story, though, is part of, I think, a longer story, it's safe to say, of Gail's books, of which I've read all three, about looking and examining how women in difficult situations, to say the least, emerge as leaders and as fighters. That's essentially what she looks at. So we're going to talk broadly about that theme, but of course I want to start with the daughters, and want to get from you just sort of, if you could explain to the audience, who are they and what did they do?
Sure. First of all, it's delightful to be here with you. We're going to keep this our secret because I am a product of HBS, so I'm sure there'll be many people from there asking how I ended up at the Kennedy School first, but I'm very glad to be here with all of you. Sorry, just intra-Harvard humor. The point of this story is to really introduce the US, and for many other folks around the world, really for the first time, although many in the region knew them, to the women who really brought ISIS to its first defeat, who played an instrumental role in handing ISIS its first battlefield loss. And if we rewind to 2014, this was at a time when folks in Washington, folks in London, those in Brussels, certainly those in the region who had been watching this unfold in very real time, were desperately worried about who was going to tackle the threat of the Islamic State from the ground. And the Daughters of Kobani is really a story about the David versus Goliath story of the folks who handed ISIS their first battlefield loss, when David also happens to be a woman. And it was something that struck me from the first time I saw it on the ground, was that this fighting force looked different. And just to set up the stakes, what are the odds that the men who bought and sold women as a central part of who they are and who they were on the Islamic State side would end up in a showdown in a town very few outside the region had ever heard of, from fighting force that very few outside the region knew well, which had women's emancipation and women's equality right at the core of who they were. And once one of the soldiers from Ashley's War, a young woman who, US service member from Florida, who some of you may know well there in the Harvard community, called me and said, "You have to come to Syria." And she started to tell me about this. And she said, not only are they fighting ISIS, but they're also fighting for women's equality. I just thought, who wouldn't want to tell that story?
And that's, so the story unfolds where you visit a couple times, you're telling their story. The end is not known, right? So you're in it. I mean, we don't know how this ends as they take on ISIS. But part of what you reflect on and what you write about, which is interesting, is as they are fighting, they're also seeking political gains within a very conservative community that they're fighting for. Can you explain how they did that? They go against fathers and husbands and basically sort of drive an agenda.
My job is to take the reader in with the flashlight in the Daughters of Kobani. It's not to give you politics, it's to show you people who were serving because of their purpose. And in this case, this was a group of women who you'll meet, Nowruz, the head of the women's protection units. If you have a dinner party, this is the person you'd want to.
She was my favorite.
And it was very much interesting for me to see who readers would respond to, because these are ordinary people pushed into extraordinary circumstances, facing an existential.
And in this process, in this political process, they forge friendships, and I wanted to, which are lovely. And I just wanted to give you a chance to talk about the female friendship, even in fighting wars.
Yeah.
Or because of fighting wars, I guess.
Well, that's it, right? We're so used to seeing the brotherhood of war.
Yes.
And I think Ashley's war, which really led directly to this and was a huge privilege to share a piece of American history, really led directly to this. And I saw in both stories, which is the sisterhood of war. Yeah. And truly the thing that nowhere in the world have I seen women more comfortable with power and less apologetic about being in charge. And it looks different. And I really thought a long time about why that was. And I think having been tested in battle against truly what US Special Operations folks would say was much closer to a conventional military force than an insurgency, right? Or the quick reaction force with heavy weaponry, with command and control, all of these things that ISIS possessed, right? At the time that they were going. So having come up against that force to the very, and you really go in Daughters of Kobani to the house by house, room by room battle and what that cost people. So I think that's the second piece, is having won at least the physical caliphate fight, so-called caliphate, right, for now. And the third piece is, I think, truly the political piece, right? Because they immediately translated military gains into political gains, which we rarely see, right? This is a non-state actor facing very real state challenges, and women who said, you know what, we're not actually going to wait until the fight is over to be politically equal. So in everything in large groups of US forces, there will be no US boots on the ground. And at the same time, he and his entire National Security Council are very aware of the urgency of stopping ISIS. So who is going to be that force, right? And the book really takes you into the hunt for a fighting force that would fight ISIS with great will and great capacity while not in the business of regime change. And it was very clear about that. And so this is the Washington kind of push me, pull you, right? Of how do you navigate this tightrope to find a fighting force that can do the job that needs to be done and that we can trust and that we feel aligned with enough on values that we can work with. And you really watch that friendship and that trust deepen from then until now. We'll publish somewhere. I'll share it with you, Juliette, as soon as it is posted. About the 2-year anniversary of the ISIS fight, which the end of the physical territory fight against ISIS marks its 2-year anniversary next week. And the folks who fought ISIS as America's partners are waiting eagerly to see what.
So I want to now talk more generally about your work and work in general about, I think, women in conflict zones and female fighters. There's no better way to put it. So this is actually your second book about woman warriors, for want of a better word. Ashley's War, where I think you and I first met because I had written a series of columns about the combat exclusion rule and how the Pentagon needed to end it. You highlight Ashley, who is a warrior, dies, but because of given that honor. So there you have the U.S. struggle with women in war, and then the Daughters of Kobani who take on a leadership. So I want to maybe talk about the commonalities, but I first want to ask you, like, what drew you to this rather unique topic, and how have people reacted to it? Because I know people had a really interesting reaction to Ashley's War in particular.
Yeah, I think it's a privilege to bring both stories to life. Ashley's War was ahead of history, right? At the time that Ashley's War came out in 2015, the band were working against people who say, what do you mean? This didn't happen. Well, actually, it did. And I want to say that, you know, this Ashley's War couldn't have happened without the men who were part of that story, right? And there were a lot of people who fought alongside these women who were part of the very benign term for a groundbreaking notion, which was the cultural support teams, on these kinds of special operations missions, on these kinds of direct action missions. What was different with the team that Lieutenant Ashley White was part of, and that some in the Kennedy School community were part of, is that it was organized. It was a direct response to a request for forces that came from then Admiral McCraven, who was then the head of Joint Special Operations Command, which was led by Admiral Olson, the first SEAL to lead Special Operations Command. And this program organized to put women on the battlefield, seeing the kind of combat experienced by less than 5% of the entire United States military. And the book was just a way to get into what did it look like to be a young American who raised her hand when her country asked. And the Daughters of Kobani is the same thing. What does it look like to stand up and say no, this far and no further? And these were women in Daughters of Kobani who took up arms, really just like women in your neighborhood and mine, just to protect their families, to protect their neighborhoods, and to protect their communities from either the Syrian regime in the middle of the chaos of the civil war or outsiders who would bring ideas and bring extremism. ISIS was not the thought when they took up arms. They never thought. And that was actually the fascinating piece of the story. What were the odds that the Americans would partner with this fighting force that had women's equality right at the heart, men and women, that ended up taking these ideas, some of which were well to the left of Bernie Sanders, of grassroots participatory democracy, environmental awareness at their center, women's equality at their center, and catapult them onto the global stage, because this was the fighting force that was going to have the will and the capability to stop ISIS. And I think that was the unlikeliness of that story was what drew me to it. And I think the commonality with Ashley's War is that, and I talk about this at the opening to Daughters, which is that every great story starts with a question you can't answer. And how was it that women in the case of Ashley's War were on special operations missions while being officially banned? How was it that America didn't know these people? And what was it that they were doing there? And that was really what that story set out to answer.
So I've got teenagers who just almost walked in. I apologize to everyone. This is
happens to me all the time. Not teenagers.
I'm getting the evil eye. I did send a text that I was busy. I wanted to talk about those commonalities. Is there a sort of common personality, common sentiment that comes into play that you can link sort of the woman of Ashley's War with the Daughters of Kobani? And I don't mean to be like, is there a women's leadership type, but just, I think people do wonder, like, physical aspects of it are different. The mental aspects of it are different. And wanted to see if you might share those as I snap away.
I love it. Well, I actually would counter the question and say, the challenge I see, and it goes back to Dressmaker, the first book about a teenage girl whose business supported her family under the Taliban, teenage young woman. When women do things that break stereotypes, break the way other people see them, and that are extraordinary, we call them exceptions. When men do things that break the rules and are extraordinary, we call them leaders. And I want to really challenge the narrative about who we see, who we count, and whose story in the quest for human dignity that is universal, whose stories we read and we take personally. And if there's one theme that I think animates the work I've had the privilege of doing, it is that suffocated opportunity is the enemy of global stability. That is whether you're talking about child and forced marriage in the United States, which we did a 2-part PBS NewsHour series about, or whether you're talking about girls' education any place around the world. That's what was so fascinating. There's a moment in Daughters of Kobani where I asked Rojda, why start the women's protection units? She's deeply introverted, loves Diego Maradona, thought she would be a pharmacist, right? I mean, never imagined being an ISIS fighter who was talking to the American special operations folks 4 times a day in the fight to retake Raqqa. And she said to me, there were 2 things that made us want to do this. One is we could not let a world stand in which women had no value. And the second thing is, we just didn't want men taking credit for our work.
Yeah.
I thought, when she said that in the middle of our interview in 2018, I said, well, there's the book, because it is about the universality and how deeply personal these stories are. And I wanted people to know them as three-dimensional human beings, right? She and Azima were sort of, for those of you who like Little Women, she was much more the Beth character, and Azima much more the Jo March, kind of boisterous, always facing down bullies, never taking any guff, whereas Roja was much quieter. And I think same as Lieutenant Ashley White, it really challenges this notion of, well, a warrior looks like this. And there's actually a moment in the Daughters of Kobani that the special operations folks talk to me a lot about, which is where this young woman, pretty slight, comes up with full of bravado to an American soldier and says, hey, I bet I killed more ISIS than you did.
Yeah.
When they're on the balcony, and he looks at her and he was like, because they were fighting from the ground. He said, I think she probably did. And there is this moment of first that the Americans are having throughout the story.
What's amazing, in the Daughters also, is how the men who as the women rise in the unit, how the men respond to them. They're sort of fearful of her. They want to obey her, that they are falling in line to her leadership, that it becomes natural to them because it's natural to her, which is just lovely to see as well. And the battlefield's a great leveler. Yeah, right. That's exactly right. So there's one of the ironies, though, about the stories you tell, and I will admit this, I had never heard of the Daughters of Kobani before your book, and actually was so mad at myself. I mean, I think maybe I heard a little bit, so mad at myself that I somehow this story, which I should have been naturally drawn to, got sidelined in our sort of traditional narratives of war, right? ISIS, U.S. bombers, and other efforts. So the irony about the last two books is, of course, you're telling stories that have been neglected in real time. Is it getting better? Like, I mean, it is. It seems like maybe that might be one thing that we can look forward to. Yeah, and I think it's up to all of you. It's up to us. There's no other people to look to. Is it getting better? Yeah. Right? I'd say three things. One is, I think the intellectual infrastructure in this country still does not treat women's stories as universal. Right. So when a story that has no women gets to be just a story. But a story that has two or more women characters is a women's story. And if I can do my small part to remove that and to shift that, then I will have done something. That's the first thing. The second thing is that there's so much noise. And in fact, at the beginning of Daughters, it's like, wait, how did I not know these people? I really wanted people in the Daughters of Kobani to go on the journey with me, truly. Yeah. Same as with Ashley's War. It's like, how do we not know these people? What were they doing? And who are they? And let's have the privilege of spending time in their world, right next to them, as they go about work that has world impact. And I do think that it comes to, you can't count what you don't see. Yeah. And if we don't see the people who are breaking ground next to us, because that story is not important. I'll tell a little story. I was working with somebody at one point who said, oh, Gail, are you just going to talk about that women's stuff again after we had seen the women's protection units in action? And I was like, keep saying that, buddy, because I know that readers will want to be in this world just like I do. So it actually structurally also has some advantages because it's such uncrowded space. And if I can help to change that in a very small way, then that would be success. Right. So in telling that story, what's the greatest misconception people have about these stories? I know as a columnist and essayist, a lot of most women, and this is just the data, they call them the 4 Fs. They write about family, fun, furniture / house, and there's an F, there's another F, family, food. That if you actually look at what women are able to publish, it's in those, even though we know lots of women are writing in different things. And so what's the biggest misconception you have in sort of trying to tell these stories? Because I know a lot of the students are, even if they don't go into writing or they don't go into media, will want to tell these stories.
So I just look for amazing stories that aren't being told that have global impact, and certainly that matter to the US. I don't care. I never set out to write about women, but I will say that I grew up in a community of single moms on the wrong side of the economic divide. Everybody I grew up with worked at least 2 jobs, right? So my mom worked at the phone company during the day when there was a phone company in Juliette, and sold Tupperware at night. And I would go with her to Tupperware parties. None of them had graduated from college. Certainly none of them had graduate degrees. And I think being an outsider class-wise has helped me enormously, because I don't look to other people to tell me what's important. I knew that the audience would be there for all 3 books. And I knew that with this story, people would see themselves in women who just said, you know what, no more, right? Like all of those rules other people have written that govern our lives, we didn't actually have a say in making them. So when Znarine, who is told, she can't go to college because that's not what girls do.
Right.
She can't marry who she loves because her uncle has picked somebody out. And she ends up becoming a role model for girls in her hometown as she helps liberate them from ISIS. I knew people would see themselves in that. And Nowruz, right, the head of the women's protection units, she says, to me, her mom never got to go to school, couldn't read. And her mother would say, your life should look different from mine.
Yeah.
And my mother would say the same thing. So I think it was the universe, knowing with confidence the universality of the story, knowing there are fewer people there, and knowing that there's a gift of being an outsider in terms of from the US side of what's important. Those are all gifts, and those all help you in having the confidence to say, I know this story matters, and it has weight, and it has impact.
So I want to do 2 more quick questions from me, and then we've got a lineup from the audience. So the first is just this is a school of public policy. We do follow current affairs. What is going on with the Kurds and ISIS, and are can we expect changes with the Biden administration in terms of those efforts?
So the epilogue of the book, Juliette, as you know, you and I talked about this, says, the ending to the story is written in invisible ink that no one can yet decipher. Right. And that remains very much the case. The President Biden has talked eloquently about the threat of ISIS and keeping the pressure on. He has also said the US will continue to support the Iraqi government and its fight against ISIS. I think the fight against ISIS continues for these folks, right? There is still an effort that has never ended of resurgence that they are working to keep the pressure on, while also dealing with thousands of ISIS foreign fighters that they're holding, and no one has a solution. And so we haven't yet reckoned with what ISIS is and was. So I think that is the question. And I do think that you'll see in the book, Secretary Blinken is in the book, Brett McGurk is in the book, and these folks are all now back in government. These are public servants who are now back in Washington, and they will be key to the policy that comes next.
Great. So now I want to ask, now I asked a geopolitical question. Now I'll ask a personal. This is part of Women's History Month, part of our efforts here at the Kennedy School. So I have to, end it with sort of, what's your 1 or 2 pieces of advice for so many of the young women listening in here before we get to the first one who's coming up?
Sure. My advice for young women and for young men is really the same, but it's particularly important for young women because of the noise, which is to listen to no one. Right? Everybody will tell you, you should do this. I expect you to do that. Think about babies, think about marriage, think about, right? In your brain, in your heart, in your gut, what you should be doing. But we, as a world, haven't told you enough to listen to yourself and to trust yourself. Do not let others dictate your path. And that's why I got a question, actually, the first book event I did was somebody said, isn't this women's rights stuff all top down? And I said, well, I hope you read the book, because actually none of this came from external areas, right? And I've been that girl who, my father's from the region. I talk about this in the prologue. We had lots of funny debates about equality and rights. But I've been that person who other people say, you can't do this. My aunt, who is from Ciudad Juarez in Mexico, who's a survivor of domestic violence, who doesn't even have a high school degree, but who worked for Elizabeth Dole in the Reagan White House, just from sheer resourcefulness and because you would want her next to you in an emergency. She always had a saying for me that said, never import other people's limitations. And I just leave you with that.
That's beautiful. That is wonderful. Well, thank you, Gail, so much. I'm going to come back and introduce a whole bunch of students. As I said, I'm texting, questioning at the same time. So our first student question is from Shelaine, and she is a joint. So she's bridging your divided life. HKS, HBS joint degree candidate. Hey, how are you?
Hi, I'm doing well. So for those on the call, I do know Gail very well. I'm in her book, Ashley's War.
Oh,
and then yes, and then was also in Syria, encouraging her to write Daughters of Kobani. So
she has all the responsibility for this.
So I owe so much to Gail and thankful for her telling these stories of women warriors, both domestically and abroad. And thank you so much. So I do have some interesting color to my question. One thing that really surprised me, I think in the West, we are very aware of, hey, women's rights are quite advanced. And when I was in Syria, one of the women fighters, Clara, who Gail's also familiar with, one day she was like, Shelaine, I kind of feel sorry for you because women in the American military aren't allowed in combat. The men don't think you're as valuable and capable as what the YPJ are doing here. So we're more advanced in that regard. And then, oh, by the way, in your society, women are over sexualized in advertisements and media and everything. And so it really took me back because I'm like, well, I think she has a point. And so it was just fascinating that there are these women in Syria in the toils of war that are arguing with me that they are actually more free and liberated than I am as an American. And so my question going into that is, yes, they have put women on the map in terms of relation to men. My question is along the lines of ethnicity. How have the Kurds made impact or potentially making impact in imparting these notions of equality in genders with Arabs in the region, with the Turks and the longstanding issues that they have had with the Kurds? So what is this impact that they're having beyond their specific plot?
Good.
First of all, I want to thank Shelaine. It's very emotional for me to see people you've been on a journey with for so long, right? Who've been part of both stories, very central to both, and part of, I think, extraordinary people that I deeply want the world to know. To your question, one of the most moving things to me, I think this goes, I would ask, because the Washington question, to Juliette's point about this is HKS, right? So the Washington policy world would always say, this is a Kurdish only project, that this is imposed upon other communities. And so I spent a lot of time in Raqqa, which is an amazing city, which has truly raised itself with the very little help from the world, from the ashes of the Islamic State. And I would ask a lot of women, all from the Arab community, in entrepreneurs, teachers, young woman who I met from the security forces who joined the police when she came back, when their town was liberated. And I said, what do you say to people who say that this is not from your community, that this is externally imposed? And she'd say, I'd say to them that they think like ISIS. And it was so interesting to me because I do think it comes down to, no, it's not perfect. Absolutely, right? And I think, but I do think there is this piece about the quest for human dignity that girls and women share across communities. And the strongest women I've met, some of them in the world, absolutely from the Arab community, young Christian women I met across ethnic lines. So it's not who is coming to impose these ideas, right? These young women are very much, and this is really part of the epilogue of the book, if the world stops talking for them, they will tell you for themselves what they want. And so I do think that there is an impact. And there's the final piece of that is that when we were in Raqqa with one of the fighters who worked with Clara, actually, Shalane, I said, you know, my father, and I asked the dumbest question. Juliette, I said, my father's from the region. I know how hard this is. Why would you start with the Middle East when you talk about women's rights? And she looked at me with such disdain and said, we're from here. Yeah. We know how hard it is, but we're writing our own history now. And I wanted readers to really contend with those ideas. Yeah.
I'm going to go. Thank you so much. Thank you. Nicholas Sung, Nick Sung, who's at the Kennedy School. You're next.
Thank you very much, Professor Kayyem. And I never really like following Shalane in class or in Q&A. I like to follow, but thank you very much. I really enjoyed reading Ashley's War, and I'm looking forward to reading the Daughters of Kobani. But I'm actually coming from class with HKS professors, Dr. Zoe Marks and Erica Chenoweth, and we were just talking about their research, which finds that not only does women's participation in violent conflict, but also nonviolent movements increase the chance for a campaign to be successful, but related to the Daughters of Kobani, it also helps to achieve gender equality in the years that follow. And yet, Drs. Marks and Chenoweth also find that women are disproportionately excluded from transitional leadership, post-conflict reconciliation, and participation in political leadership after the fighting stops. So your book centers around frontline women warriors, as Professor Kayyem said, in the role in fighting ISIS. But as Professor Kayyem teased, this ending is unknown. Yeah. Do you find that the Daughters of Kobani are able to and have been able to leverage their positions in the front line into actual positions of leadership and authority as they're leaving the battlefield?
So I would say with this, I really appreciate the question. I'm going to start with the book and then I'll pan out briefly. So in the book, it really goes into the fact that this was always about the quest for equality for those women. The battlefield was a means to an end for the governance piece. And it is even after October 2019, even today in Raqqa, there's a women's council. In Raqqa, there's a co-head of the civil council, Layla Mustafa, who is a woman. And there is in Tabqa, same thing, right? And these are places that might not necessarily beforehand have seen women in those kinds of leadership roles. So all of this is continuing. And if you look at the governing documents recognized by nobody outside the region, but there for the region, they talk about women's yes to girls' education, no to child marriage, no to dowry. These are all yes to women's equality, yes to women judges trying cases that have to do with women. So all of this, which is talked about in the book, is really the political piece, which was their goal. And as Fauzi Youssef from the political side said to me, we're building a lake in the desert. It doesn't happen quickly, but we have to start somewhere. So panning back out to your question more broadly, I've had the privilege of being in Afghanistan a lot and writing a lot about it. I mean, now for 16 years. And I would say this, the one thing that all sides often can agree on is that there's no need to have women involved. And so I said, this is a point of unity women should not offer going forward. And I joked with the Americans about this actually at the embassy in Kabul and lots of other places where I've given briefings. And now I think you do see a push from the US side, from the EU side, and really even most importantly, from Afghan women themselves who have been the most powerful voices saying, we deserve a voice in our country's future and we will not be excluded. And I highly recommend people follow those women leaders on Twitter and other places and really tell your officials that it matters that women's voices are heard.
Thank you. Kiana is a student at the college. I'm not sure if you're here or somewhere else.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for being here today. My name is Kiana, I'm an undergrad, and I'm studying film. So also very much invested in the work you're doing with storytelling to challenge assumptions and stereotypes, because it's very in line with what I want to do with my own life. In that vein, I'm wondering what like in telling stories that are constantly challenging common assumptions and perceptions, I'm wondering what kinds of assumptions were dispelled for you personally in the storytelling process. You mentioned, the power of the lens of an outsider, which I think is really, really powerful as well. But of course, it comes with its blind spots. And I'm wondering what blind spots you were made aware of in your storytelling process, and how you sort of sought to address those.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. And when I talk about being an outsider, I really mean to US elite kind of conversation in terms of the intellectual infrastructure. Obviously, now I have the privilege of being in those circles frequently, but I do think I retain the view of, and I write for the people I grew up with very much. I deeply believe that national security is the work of everybody. It belongs to everybody, and we must talk to people where they are. Part of the issue of having less than 1% of this country fight 100% of its wars for 2 decades is that very few people feel it personally, and very few leaders want to speak directly to the public to remind them that these wars are ongoing. It's almost as if we don't talk about them, then we don't have to contend with them. And I want to make people feel them. I want people to know who it is who's doing that. And I also want them to know how funny they are, how human they are, right? There's a moment in Daughters of Kobani when Roja's mother called. And those of you from traditional cultures, if your parent calls, you have to answer. It does not matter where you are, right? So in the middle of this battle for Kobani, where they're outnumbered, where things aren't going well, she picks up the phone and just puts it out, right? So that her mother hears the bullets going by and her mother's wailing. And it's that humanity and the juxtaposition of the humanity and the inhumanity that I wanted to show. I will say with Daughters of Kobani, I had heard from people saying, that there were fewer myths to dispel because I knew just a little bit about it, but I did not go in with a lot of preconceptions. I definitely knew the kind of internal feeling that you would have as I have a fraction of an inkling what that would feel like to challenge those norms. So that Rojda, when her uncle dresses up as a ghost to keep her and her cousin from playing soccer because that's shameful, right? I understood where she'd be coming from. And then with Ashley's War, in many ways, it was a big leap because I didn't know women serving. And I wrote this piece for Medium called Patriotism, Feminism, and the Way We See Our War Stories, about how few people have taken on that challenge of showing people who these women were and how that contributed to really ignorant stereotypes and also just disrespect for women who served, which we would not share with anybody else in uniform. And so I think it's that piece of really taking the kind of one-dimensional view away and showing the complexity, the humanity, the contradictions, the heart, the humor, that is so very important to not go in. It's never about my politics. My politics don't belong in these stories. It is about a flashlight to take readers in.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kiana. We have Julia also from the college. Not sure where you are.
Hi, I'm Julia. Thanks so much for being here today. I'm an undergraduate at the college, and something I've been interested about is you talked about how the battlefield sort of serves as like a means to an end for these women. And in the process of writing this book and like looking at their futures, have you seen any challenges to these women's, like, I guess, reintegration or in change in perception of their communities of these women as they've sort of returned from battle?
So there was a moment in Kobani. We were in there. I was there in 2017, and we were just walking around interviewing people as you do, right? And there was an older man sitting in front of this beautiful statue that's in the book, and the photo cut out in the book of a woman warrior, one of the women who sacrificed her life to stop ISIS. It's a huge statue in the town. Just think about that, a larger than life statue of a warrior who happened to be a woman in the middle of the town, right? Just think about, and people come up and they drive up and they take pictures in front of it. And that happens all day. So there was an older man having tea, and I went up to him and I said, "Are you from here?" And he says, "Yes." And I said, "What do you think about the statue? You're having tea in front of the statue. What do you think about the women who fought ISIS?" He said, "Well, here's my daughter." And he took out a photo of his daughter who'd been injured 3 times. And he said, "I can't get her to stop going to the front. I can't get her to stop fighting." This was 2017 when the ISIS physical terrain fight was still going on. And I said, "What did you expect when she was born?" And he said, "Well, I definitely didn't expect this." But if this helps us as a people protect ourselves and our rights, then I'm proud of her. And the other thing that struck me to your question was the generational shift. I interviewed young women from the Christian community. The same as the Arab community, almost none of them had literate mothers. Almost none of them had mothers who had the chance to go to school for more than a year or two. And if you think about that huge generational change, right? That whole notion of seeing the role models around, I mean, that's very much in play. How long it lasts, how it endures. I'm amazed, honestly, that it endures to today. But I think we will wait and see. But it does, no matter what, and this is the last moment of the book, is never saying, no matter what, this happened.
I'm going to let the last question go to Yvonne, who is a co-director of the W3D, and with Yvonne and Tara, who I think is somewhere here, help run the Homeland Security Project, where Tara is the program director, which also is a co-host, which that's the one thing that I do run, and I forgot to thank my team. So thank to both of them for putting this together, and you get the last question.
Great, thank you. And thanks, Gail, for all of your work pulling back the curtain on these stories of inspiring women and their strength in the face of such adversity. And so I'd love to end on a question about what have you seen in engaging with all of these different women and talking to them? What sources of strength and resiliency are they pulling from? And what lessons have you learned from them over the course of your work?
It's a great question.
Yeah.
Two things. One is a number of them had fathers who treated them exactly as their brothers and who were their biggest supporters and their closest allies. That was very much the case in Ashley's War. I know Shalane can talk with you about that. Yeah. It was very much the case in The Dressmaker of Kharkana, where Kamala Siddiqui, her father said, and I said, are you surprised that Kamala was able to support your whole, your neighborhood really under the Taliban when you weren't even there? And he said, no, first God, then myself, and then Kamala took care of our family. And he taught me something that always stayed with me, which is that you do as much as you can for as many as you can for as long as you can. And I fall short on that regularly, but I think his words to guide us, they're great ones. And I think he really influenced her that way. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, and maybe this is why I'm so drawn to them, they don't think they've been doing anything extraordinary because all they're doing is living their God-given gift to realize their potential and live with dignity. So, I've not yet met a young woman who says, I set out to break the, no, I've never seen that. I set out to stop, why should I let these people run my neighborhood, right? And just one point on that, there was a young woman from Raqqa, from the Arab community, whose brother joined ISIS, and she's in the end of the Daughters of Kobani. Brothers joined ISIS, forced her to marry an ISIS fighter, lived through hell, like true hell, to the point that even I, who have had the privilege of hearing a lot, I had to physically hold my arms to keep from being sick in the middle of her story, because I couldn't even imagine, with my imagination at work, what she had faced. And that she came back to her hometown after all of this. The People's Protection Units, the SDF, right, US partner on the ground, said, you have your choice of what you want to do next. And she said, I want to join the Women's Protection Units. And I said, why? You've been through everything. Why would you possibly put on a uniform, come here every day? And she said, why should a world in which this is allowed be? And I thought about that all the time. It was just that ability to be brave and to question without doing it for any kind of larger purpose other than the just quest for dignity and opportunity. It is universal. It does not get bound by any gender, any ethnicity, any geography, any zip code, any neighborhood. And I want people to feel that.
I don't know a better way to end than with that line, but Gail, I'll leave. We have a few moments, not many. If there's any final comments before we say goodbye, and thank you.
I just want to thank you all for contending with this and say what a privilege it is to share this story. And I want to push you all. And I said, don't listen to anybody. There weren't that many people who thought that this book would become third bestseller, and but there were some. And it means that you must always believe in yourself and in your ability to connect with people who see the world in a way that challenges the rules, to not be deterred. So many times you'll see people up here speaking and you think they never went through failure, they never went through adversity, right? That is quite the opposite. For many years, it's like hiking up an icicle. But all of you are the reason why this work matters, right? That readers take it personally. So please don't look for the them, it's the us. There is no other, it's just us in it. And the best storytelling takes away the other. And so with that, I just want to say thank you for having me. It's really a privilege.
That was beautiful. Thank you, Gail. It's been a pleasure spending this hour with you. We were joking that we do miss drinks, and one day we'll get you back to Cambridge, maybe very soon, hopefully. And thanks to the IOP Forum, W3D, and the team at the Homeland Security Project at the Belfer Center for getting this together so quickly. And to all of you in the audience, thank you again for your time today. Be safe, be well, keep wearing your mask, and we will see you soon. I say that confidently.
Thank you.
Thank you.